The ancient leather-bound tome felt heavy in Christopher Brown's hands, its weathered pages exhaling the musty breath of centuries as he carefully turned them under the amber glow of his desk lamp. Outside his narrow window in the Vatican archives, Rome's evening lights twinkled like earthbound stars, but Christopher's attention remained fixed on the manuscript before him. At 35, the American scholar had spent nearly a decade earning the privilege to access the Vatican's most obscure collections. His academic reputation for meticulous analysis of medieval Latin and Greek texts, opening doors that remained closed to most. With his lean frame, prematurely silver-streaked dark hair, and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the appearance of a man outside of time, Christopher had become a familiar sight in the labyrinthine corridors of the Holy See's most guarded repositories of knowledge. The manuscript that now commanded his complete attention had come to him through an unlikely chain of events. 3 days earlier, while researching 13th-century papal correspondence in the Archivio Segreto Vaticano, he had noticed a loose stone in the ancient wall behind a seldom-accessed shelf. Scholar's curiosity had led him to investigate, revealing a small cavity containing this unmarked volume that appeared to have been deliberately concealed. Protocol dictated that he should have immediately reported the discovery to Cardinal Rossi, the stern overseer of the archives, but something, intuition, or perhaps academic greed, had compelled Christopher to slip the book into his satchel unnoticed. Now, in the privacy of his modest quarters provided to visiting scholars, he was beginning to question the wisdom of that decision. The text was unlike anything he had encountered in his years of research. Written in a peculiar form of ecclesiastical Latin, interspersed with symbols he couldn't identify, it appeared to be a record of proceedings conducted by a group calling themselves the Custodes Veritatis, guardians of truth. Initial entries dated back to 1432, during the papacy of Eugene IV. But what troubled Christopher was not the age of the document, but its contents. The passages he had managed to translate described rituals conducted in chambers beneath the Vatican, ceremonies that involved vessels and sacrificial subjects in the pursuit of what was referred to only as the 11th revelation. "This can't be authentic," Christopher murmured to himself, rubbing his tired eyes as the clock on his wall crept past midnight. Yet the manuscript's physical characteristics, the binding techniques, the composition of the parchment, the particular formulation of the ink, all aligned with authentic documents from the period. More disturbing still were the detailed sketches interspersed throughout the text, architectural diagrams of underground chambers that appeared to correspond with parts of the Vatican's foundations, and ritualistic implements decorated with symbols that merged Christian iconography with something far more ancient and unsettling. A knock at his door startled Christopher from his absorption. Hastily covering the manuscript with research papers, he crossed to the door, his heart pounding with unwarranted guilt. "Who is it?" he called, his voice betraying more tension than he intended. "Dr. Brown?" "It's Sophia Ricci from the linguistics department," came the reply, the Italian accent distinct, but the English flawless. "I have those translations of the Aramaic fragments you requested." Relief washed over Christopher as he opened the door to the young researcher he had collaborated with on several occasions, her presence a welcome interruption to the increasingly dark path his thoughts had been traveling. Sophia's usual cheerful expression was absent as she handed him a folder, her dark eyes studying his face with unusual intensity. "You look troubled, Christopher," she observed, using his first name despite their normally formal workplace relationship. "Is everything all right?" The question seemed innocent enough, but Christopher couldn't shake the feeling that it carried more weight than casual concern. "Just tired," he replied with a forced smile. "Lost track of time with these texts." Sophia nodded, but her gaze drifted past him to his desk, where the edge of the leather-bound manuscript remained visible despite his hasty attempt to conceal it. "That's not from our current collection, is it?" she asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper. The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken tension. Christopher had known Sophia for 3 years, brilliant, dedicated, with an uncanny ability to decipher obscure languages. She had proven trustworthy in their previous collaborations, but the manuscript's disturbing contents made him hesitate. Finally, making a decision he hoped wouldn't prove catastrophic, he stepped aside. "Come in, Sophia. I need a second opinion on something unusual." She entered, closing the door quietly behind her, her movements deliberate as if she sensed the gravity of what she was about to be shown. Christopher returned to his desk, pushing aside the papers to reveal the manuscript. "I found this hidden in the archives. It's not catalogued anywhere, and its contents—" He trailed off, watching her face carefully as she approached. Sophia's expression transformed as she examined the open pages, her academic composure giving way to visible shock. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, her fingertips hovering over the text without touching it, as if the parchment might burn her skin. When Christopher explained its discovery, she shook her head slowly. "Christopher, there are stories among the long-term archivists, whispers about forbidden texts removed from official records. I've always dismissed them as the kind of myths that accumulate in ancient institutions. But this—" She turned to him, her face pale in the lamplight. "If this is authentic, you need to be extremely careful about who knows you have it." "You recognize something in it?" Christopher asked, the scholarly excitement of discovery warring with a growing sense of unease. Sophia hesitated, then pointed to a symbol recurring throughout the text, a stylized eye within a triangle, surrounded by what appeared to be flames. "This mark belongs to an order I've only seen referenced in fragmentary texts that subsequently disappeared from the archives. They were said to operate with papal authority, but outside of conventional church hierarchy, dedicated to containing what they called corrupting truths." She met his gaze directly. "Christopher, if you've found their records, you've stumbled onto something the Vatican has been actively suppressing for centuries." The weight of her words settled around them like a shroud. Outside, a sudden rain began to patter against the window, the weather shifting as dramatically as Christopher's understanding of his discovery. "I need to translate more of it," he said finally, academic determination overriding caution. "These records seem to document actual practices, not just theological theories. If they were conducting rituals beneath the Vatican itself," Sophia's hand on his arm stopped him. "Then we need to know exactly what we're dealing with before we proceed," she finished for him. "I can help with the translation. There are elements of Old Provençal mixed with the Latin that I recognize. But Christopher," her grip tightened slightly, "we tell no one else until we understand what we've found. Promise me." Christopher nodded, the seriousness in her eyes reinforcing his own growing sense that they stood at the threshold of something far more consequential than an academic discovery. As Sophia pulled up a chair beside him, the rain intensified outside, drumming against the ancient stones of the Vatican as if nature itself was responding to the unearthing of long-buried secrets. Together, they bent over the manuscript, voices hushed as they began to decipher the careful documentation of horrors performed in the name of faith and hidden beneath centuries of silence. Neither spoke the thought that hung between them, that some truths, once uncovered, cannot be buried again, and that knowledge, especially of darkness, carries its own inescapable price. Christopher felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain-cooled air seeping through the old window frame. As Sophia translated a particularly disturbing passage describing the preparation of vessels, a clinical account of how individuals were selected and conditioned for ritual use, he found himself staring at the ornate crucifix hanging on his wall, a gift from his devoutly Catholic mother when he'd received this prestigious Vatican appointment. The contrast between the symbol of salvation and the text before him created a cognitive dissonance that made his head throb. The Vatican had always represented the pinnacle of his academic journey, a repository of humanity's greatest spiritual and intellectual achievements. Now, as he and Sophia worked through the night, that foundation was cracking beneath him, revealing something ancient and terrible in the shadows below. Morning came, with watery sunlight filtering through lingering rain clouds, finding Christopher and Sophia still hunched over the manuscript, their eyes red-rimmed from strain and lack of sleep. Empty coffee cups littered the small desk, testament to their night-long vigil. They had made significant progress in translating nearly a third of the text, enough to confirm their worst suspicions. The Custodes Veritatis had indeed conducted rituals involving human subjects, all meticulously documented with the dispassionate precision of scientists recording experiments. The most recent entries dated to 1903, suggesting that whatever this order was, it had maintained its activities well into the modern era. "We need to see if these chambers still exist," Christopher said, stretching his stiff back as he paced the small room. The architectural diagrams in the manuscript detailed a network of rooms extending from the lowest level of the Vatican grottos, the underground chambers beneath St. Peter's Basilica, where popes and church dignitaries were entombed. According to the text, a concealed entrance led to spaces that predated even the earliest Christian constructions on the site. Sophia looked up from the desk, concern evident in her exhausted face. "Christopher, these aren't just historical accounts we're reading. If the order was still active in 1903, who's to say they aren't still operating now? We need to be strategic about this." Christopher paused by the window, watching Vatican staff and early tourists cross St. Peter's Square in the distance. His mind raced with implications. If even a fraction of what they'd translated was true, it meant that for centuries, an inner circle within the church had been conducting rituals that violated everything Christianity professed to stand for. And yet, the manuscript portrayed these acts not as heresy, but as necessary protection, a containment of forces that would otherwise threaten the church and humanity itself. "We need more information before we go exploring," he agreed finally. "The manuscript mentions ledgers kept in the Archive of Necessity. That might be a coded reference to a specific location in the secret archives." "I can help with that," Sophia said, closing the manuscript carefully. "I've been cataloguing a collection of administrative records from the 17th century, documents that map the evolving organization of the Vatican's various departments and archives. If this Archive of Necessity existed officially, even under another name, there might be traces in those records." She stood, gathering her notes and tucking them into her bag. "I'll search discreetly today. Meanwhile, you should continue the translation. Focus on the later entries that might give us more specific information about current locations or practices." As she prepared to leave, she hesitated at the door. "Christopher, be careful today. Don't let anyone see what you're working on, and watch for any unusual attention. My grandmother used to say that old secrets have long shadows, and those shadows have eyes." Alone in his room after Sophia's departure, Christopher concealed the manuscript in a locked compartment of his suitcase and forced himself to shower and change. He needed to maintain appearances, to move through his day as if nothing had changed. At precisely 9 a.m., he entered the main hall of the secret archives, nodding to the security guard and scanning his ID card as he did every morning. The familiar smell of ancient paper and preservation chemicals greeted him, normally a comfort, but now carrying ominous undertones. He requested several volumes related to his official research project, a study of communications between the Vatican and Eastern Orthodox churches during the 15th century, and settled at his usual table, arranging the legitimate documents around him as camouflage for his true focus. Throughout the morning, Christopher maintained this facade, while covertly transcribing portions of the forbidden manuscript from memory and researching references it contained. His academic training had blessed him with a nearly photographic recall for texts, allowing him to verify names, dates, and places mentioned in the Custodes Veritatis records. Each confirmation sent a chill through him. Figures he had encountered in mainstream church history appeared in the manuscript in disturbing new contexts, their public legacies contrasting sharply with their secret activities. Most troubling were references to a ritual called the cleansing, a ceremony conducted 7 times between 1490 and 1901, each instance coinciding with years of documented disappearances in Rome's historical records. At noon, Christopher took his usual lunch break in the small cafe adjacent to the Vatican museums, his mind so preoccupied that he barely tasted the panini and espresso before him. The cafe was crowded with the usual mix of Vatican employees and researchers. their conversations creating a buffer of normality around him. He was so lost in thought that he failed to notice Cardinal Rossi until the man was standing directly before his table, the sudden shadow causing Christopher to look up with a start. "Dr. Brown," the cardinal said, his thin lips curved in what might generously be called a smile, "you seem exceptionally absorbed today. I trust your research is proving fruitful." "Cardinal Rossi," Christopher acknowledged, struggling to keep his voice casual. "Yes, very productive. The 15th century correspondence is revealing some fascinating nuances in how the Vatican navigated the fall of Constantinople." He gestured to the legitimate research notes visible in his open folder, silently thanking his earlier self for maintaining detailed records of his official work. The cardinal's pale blue eyes studied him with unsettling intensity. At 67, Rossi was a formidable figure in the Vatican hierarchy, officially the prefect of the secret archives, but rumored to have considerable influence beyond his formal role. His aristocratic Italian features and silver hair gave him a patrician air that Christopher had once admired, but now found vaguely menacing. "Indeed," the cardinal replied, his accent giving the English word a musical quality. "History's lessons are often found in its shadows, wouldn't you agree?" Before Christopher could respond to this oddly resonant comment, Rossi continued, "I understand you've been collaborating with Dr. Ricci on some translations. A talented linguist, though perhaps sometimes too curious for her own scholarly good, a trait you seem to share." There was something in the way he emphasized these words that sent alarm bells ringing in Christopher's mind. "A healthy curiosity is essential in our line of work," Christopher replied carefully, maintaining eye contact despite a growing desire to look away from that penetrating gaze. The cardinal's smile remained fixed, never reaching his eyes. "Of course, though wisdom lies in knowing which doors are better left unopened." He paused, then added with deliberate casualness, "I notice you haven't requested access to the lower archive sections recently. Given your current research focus, you might find relevant materials in Section 37C. I'd be happy to authorize your access." The offer seemed innocent enough, even helpful, but something in Rossi's tone suggested a test being administered. Christopher forced a grateful smile. "Thank you, Cardinal. I'll certainly look into that tomorrow." With a slight nod, Rossi departed, moving through the crowded cafe with the gliding grace of a man accustomed to commanding space. Only when the cardinal was well out of sight did Christopher release the breath he'd been holding. Section 37C was indeed related to his official research, but the cardinal's specific mention of it felt like a probe, as if Rossi suspected Christopher's attention had wandered from his stated purpose and was offering a chance to return to legitimate paths. More troubling was the reference to Sophia and their collaboration, which they had kept relatively quiet. The implication was clear. Their activities were being monitored more closely than they had realized. Christopher abandoned the remainder of his lunch, suddenly eager to warn Sophia and continue their translations in the security of his quarters. As he crossed St. Peter's Square toward the archives, Christopher became acutely aware of the vastness of the Vatican around him. Beneath the soaring dome of the basilica and the imposing colonnades, he felt microscopic, a mote of dust that had drifted into an ancient machine of immense power and complexity. The manuscript had referred to eyes within the walls, a phrase he had initially interpreted as metaphorical, but now seemed disturbingly literal. He scanned the square, noting security cameras, Swiss guards at their posts, plainclothes security personnel almost invisible among the tourists, and countless windows overlooking the open space. How many of those eyes were tracking his movements? How quickly would the Vatican's security apparatus respond if they knew what he had discovered? Christopher was so preoccupied with these thoughts that he nearly collided with Father Thomas Brennan, an American priest who served as a translator for English-speaking visitors to the Vatican. "Whoa there, Dr. Brown," the priest said good-naturedly, steadying Christopher with a hand on his arm. "You look like a man being chased by demons. Academic deadlines again." In his early 40s, with an open, friendly face that belied his considerable theological intellect, Father Brennan had been one of Christopher's first contacts when he arrived at the Vatican. They had occasionally shared drinks and discussions about history and faith, conversations Christopher had valued for their intellectual honesty. Now faced with the priest's genuine concern, Christopher felt a powerful urge to confide in someone outside the growing conspiracy he sensed around him. "Actually, Father, I've encountered some troubling material in my research," Christopher said, lowering his voice despite the open space around them. "Historical accounts that contradict the Church's official positions in disturbing ways. I'm not sure how to proceed." It was vague enough to be safe, but a genuine expression of his dilemma. Father Brennan's expression grew serious, his eyes showing understanding rather than alarm. "The Church's history is not without its dark chapters, as you well know. Perhaps we could discuss your findings over dinner. My quarters are private, and sometimes an outside perspective helps." The invitation seemed sincere, a lifeline of normalcy in Christopher's increasingly paranoid state. "I'd appreciate that," he replied, feeling a measure of relief. They arranged to meet that evening, and Christopher continued to the archives with a slightly lighter step, grateful for the reminder that not everyone within the Vatican walls was part of some ancient conspiracy. The remainder of the afternoon passed without incident, though Christopher found himself jumping at small noises and studying the faces of archive staff with new suspicion. By the time he returned to his quarters at 5 o'clock, he was mentally exhausted from maintaining his facade of normalcy. He had just unlocked his door when Sophia appeared at the end of the hallway, her brisk walk and tight expression immediately alerting him that something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked as she slipped past him into the room. She waited until he had closed and locked the door before responding. "The administrative records I was searching, they've been removed from the collection. When I inquired, I was told they were undergoing special conservation procedures and would be unavailable for several weeks." Her eyes met his, wide with implication. "Christopher, I accessed those same documents 2 days ago. They were in perfect condition. The coincidence was too precise to ignore." Whatever trail Sophia had been following had been deliberately cut off, which meant their interest in the Custodes Veritatis had not gone unnoticed. Christopher shared his encounter with Cardinal Rossi, watching Sophia's face pale as he described the veiled warnings. "This confirms it," she said quietly. "The order still exists, and they know we've found their records." She sank onto the edge of his bed, the gravity of their situation settling visibly onto her shoulders. "What do we do now? If they're actively monitoring us and removing evidence—" Christopher moved to his suitcase, unlocking the compartment where he had hidden the manuscript. "We accelerate our plans," he said, the determination in his voice surprising even himself. "Tonight, after my dinner with Father Brennan, we find that entrance to the underground chambers. The manuscript includes detailed instructions. If we can document what's down there, create evidence they can't simply make disappear." Sophia looked dubious. "That's incredibly risky, Christopher. If we're caught trespassing in restricted areas, especially after hours." He cut her off with a gesture. "We're already at risk. They know we've found something, but they can't be certain how much we've translated or what we plan to do with the information. Right now, they're watching and controlling access to corroborating evidence, but that's just the first step. If the manuscript is accurate about what this order has done, what they might still be doing, we can't afford to wait until they decide to take more direct action." The logic was sound, but both of them recognized the fear driving it. Fear not just of what might be hidden beneath the Vatican, but of what might happen to those who discovered it. Their discussion was interrupted by Christopher's alarm, reminding him of his dinner engagement with Father Brennan. As he prepared to leave, Sophia agreed to meet him at midnight near the entrance to the Vatican grottos, where late-night prayer vigils sometimes took place, providing them cover to be in the basilica after standard hours. "Be careful with Father Brennan," she warned as he reached for the door. "Even if he's not directly involved, he's still a Vatican priest. His first loyalty will be to the Church." Christopher nodded, though in truth, the chance to speak with someone who might offer perspective outside their increasingly paranoid bubble was exactly what he needed. As he made his way through the Vatican's evening quiet corridors toward Father Brennan's quarters, he found himself praying for the first time in years, not to the God of his childhood faith, but to whatever power might exist that valued truth above darkness and light above the comfort of ancient shadows. Father Brennan's quarters were modestly furnished, but comfortable, with bookshelves lining the walls and a small dining table set for two by a window overlooking a quiet courtyard. The priest greeted Christopher warmly, serving a simple meal of pasta and wine that under normal circumstances would have been deeply appreciated after a long day of research. As it was, Christopher found himself picking at his food, his appetite diminished by the weight of all he had discovered and the decisions that lay before him. Their conversation began with safe topics: American politics, mutual acquaintances, recent exhibitions at the Vatican museums. But gradually, Father Brennan steered them toward the concern Christopher had expressed earlier. "So, these troubling historical accounts you mentioned," the priest said, refilling their wine glasses. "I've spent enough time with scholars to know that troubling usually means either morally questionable or contradictory to established narratives. Which category has captured your attention?" His tone was light, but his eyes were serious, showing genuine interest rather than the guarded wariness Christopher had come to expect from Vatican officials. Still, caution prevailed. "A bit of both, actually," Christopher replied carefully. "I've encountered evidence of practices within the church that contradict its public teachings. Organized activities spanning centuries, apparently sanctioned at the highest levels despite violating core Christian principles." Father Brennan nodded slowly, seemingly unsurprised. "The church is a human institution, despite its divine mission," he said after a thoughtful pause. "Throughout history, those entrusted with its care have sometimes justified terrible acts in the name of protecting the faith. The Inquisition, the Crusades, the persecution of scientists and freethinkers. We acknowledge these failures now, painful as they are." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "But the church also learns, Christopher. It evolves. The Second Vatican Council demonstrated that, opening windows that had been shut for centuries, admitting past errors, embracing dialogue rather than condemnation. Whatever dark chapter you've uncovered, I assure you it represents the Church's past, not its present." There was such sincerity in the priest's words that Christopher found himself wavering, tempted to share the full truth of what he had discovered. Instead, he posed a hypothetical question. "What if it's not the past, Thomas? What if these practices continued into modern times, possibly even the present day? What if there exists within the Church a group that believes certain acts, even deeply immoral ones, are justified for a greater good they've defined for themselves?" Father Brennan's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of something, recognition, concern, crossing his features before he composed himself. "That would indeed be troubling," he acknowledged, "but also extremely difficult to believe without compelling evidence. The Vatican of today operates under intense scrutiny, both internal and external. Secret chambers, clandestine rituals. These sound more like plot elements from a Dan Brown novel than reality." The dismissive comparison stung, though Christopher recognized it as a common defense mechanism when confronted with uncomfortable possibilities. "Evidence is precisely the issue," he countered. "Historical records being removed from archives, access to certain areas restricted without explanation, individuals who ask too many questions, finding their research mysteriously redirected." He stopped himself, realizing he had ventured too close to describing his actual situation. Father Brennan was studying him with increased intensity now, the friendly dinner companion replaced by something more complex, not hostile, but keenly analytical. "Christopher," he said finally, his voice gentle but firm, "whatever you've found has clearly disturbed you deeply. I'd like to help, but I can only do so if you're specific about what you're dealing with." The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken possibilities. Christopher desperately wanted to trust the priest, to share the burden of knowledge that had grown increasingly heavy since he had discovered the manuscript. But Sophia's warning echoed in his mind, along with the manuscript's own accounts of how the Custodes Veritatis maintained their secrecy through a network of loyal agents throughout the church hierarchy. "I need more time," Christopher said at last, "to verify certain details, to be absolutely certain before making any claims. I hope you understand." Father Brennan nodded, disappointment visible in his eyes but respect in his voice as he replied, "Of course. Just remember that isolation rarely leads to clarity. When you're ready to talk, really talk, my door is open." The remainder of their dinner passed in more mundane conversation, though an undercurrent of tension remained. As Christopher prepared to leave around 11, Father Brennan walked him to the door, placing a hand on his shoulder in a gesture both comforting and somehow proprietary. "Be careful, Christopher," he said, echoing Sophia's earlier warning, but with an ambiguity that could be interpreted multiple ways. "The pursuit of truth is sacred work, but context matters. The same discovery that enlightens in one context can devastate in another." Christopher nodded, thanking him for dinner and the conversation before stepping into the corridor, feeling the priest's gaze follow him until he turned the corner toward his own quarters. Once out of sight, Christopher checked his watch. Nearly 11:30. Instead of returning to his room, he made his way toward their agreed meeting point near the entrance to the Vatican grottos. The vast expanse of St. Peter's Basilica was eerily quiet at this hour, the daytime crowds of tourists replaced by a handful of worshippers keeping late-night vigil and the occasional guard making rounds. Christopher moved purposefully, having learned that confidence was the best way to avoid unwanted attention. He carried a small backpack containing essentials for their expedition: flashlights, his phone with camera, a copy of the architectural diagrams from the manuscript, and a small toolkit that might prove useful for accessing sealed spaces. Sophia was already waiting when he arrived, her slender figure partially concealed behind a marble column, dressed in dark clothing that would help them blend into the shadows of the underground spaces. "Any problems?" she whispered as he joined her. Christopher shook his head, briefly recounting his dinner with Father Brennan, while omitting his own moments of doubt and temptation to confide in the priest. Sophia listened intently, then nodded toward a side entrance to the grottos. "The night guards rotate positions at midnight," she explained. "We'll have approximately 3 minutes when that section is unwatched. According to the manuscript, the entrance to the deeper levels should be near the tomb of Pope Pius VI, concealed behind a movable stone panel." The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness, each distant footstep or voice causing them to press deeper into the shadows. Finally, Sophia checked her watch and nodded. Now, they moved swiftly from their hiding place, descending the stairs into the grottos with practiced quiet. The underground level of St. Peter's was a maze of chapels and tombs, the air noticeably cooler and heavy with history. Navigating by the light of a small penlight, they made their way past the ornate sarcophagi of popes and church dignitaries, the glint of gold and marble muted in the minimal illumination. Christopher felt a growing sense of trespass, not just of physical boundaries, but of historical and spiritual ones. Whatever his doubts about the church as an institution, these spaces were undeniably sacred to millions. They located the tomb of Pius VI without difficulty, its neoclassical design distinct among the varied styles of papal monuments. According to the manuscript, the concealed entrance should be in the wall directly behind it, activated by pressing specific points on the decorative stonework in a precise sequence. Christopher referenced the diagram he had memorized, directing Sophia to press her fingers against seemingly random elements of the carved border, while he did the same on the opposite side. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then a barely audible click, followed by the scraping of stone against stone as a section of the wall receded and slid sideways, revealing a narrow passage beyond. The air that wafted from the opening was noticeably different, older, more stagnant, carrying scents of mineral deposits and something else that triggered primitive warnings in Christopher's brain. They exchanged glances, the reality of what they were about to do suddenly more concrete than all their theoretical discussions. "We document everything," Christopher whispered, removing his flashlight and phone. "Photos, videos, notes. Whatever we find, we create a record too substantial to disappear." Sophia nodded, her expression resolute despite the fear visible in her eyes. Together, they stepped through the opening into a passageway that sloped gently downward, the stone beneath their feet worn smooth by centuries of use, despite the apparent abandonment of the entrance mechanism. The passage extended for approximately 50 meters before opening into a small antechamber. Their flashlight beams revealed walls covered in faded frescoes depicting biblical scenes interspersed with the now familiar symbol of the eye within a triangle of flames. An ornate wooden door stood at the far end, its surface carved with intricate patterns that upon closer inspection incorporated subtle anatomical elements, eyes, hands, and what appeared to be stylized organs integrated into the decorative swirls. "This matches the descriptions in the manuscript," Sophia whispered, her voice tight with tension. "The chamber of preparation, where they would ready the subjects." "No." Christopher nodded grimly, photographing the door and the frescoes before grasping the iron handle. It turned with surprising ease, as if the mechanism had been recently maintained. Beyond the door lay a space that stole the breath from their lungs, a circular chamber approximately 15 meters in diameter, its domed ceiling painted to resemble a night sky dominated by unfamiliar constellations. The walls were lined with stone shelves containing hundreds of glass containers of various sizes, each filled with substances ranging from clear liquids to preserved organic matter that Christopher refused to examine too closely. At the center of the room stood a marble table, reminiscent of an altar, its surface stained with dark discolorations that centuries had failed to completely erase. Most disturbing were the restraints attached to the table, leather straps reinforced with metal, positioned to secure a human body at the ankles, wrists, and across the torso and forehead. "My God," Sophia breathed, her flashlight beam trembling slightly as it played across the macabre scene. The manuscript wasn't metaphorical. This is exactly what it described, the place where they performed the purification of vessels. Christopher moved around the chamber in a daze, documenting everything with mechanical precision, while his mind struggled to process the implications. The manuscript had detailed how individuals, usually those considered expendable, criminals, the mentally ill, or those who had witnessed things the custodes veritatis wished to keep hidden, were prepared through a series of rituals designed to make them suitable vessels for whatever force the order sought to contain or channel. He had hoped, despite the explicit descriptions, that these accounts were allegorical or exaggerated. The physical evidence before him destroyed that hope completely. Whatever the custodes veritatis had been doing beneath the Vatican for centuries, it had involved real people subjected to real suffering on the very altar that now stood before him. "Christopher," Sophia called softly from across the chamber, "there's another door here, and I think I hear something beyond it." He joined her quickly, straining his ears in the silence. At first he detected nothing, then faintly but unmistakably, a sound like distant chanting, the words indistinguishable but the cadence rhythmic and purposeful. Their eyes met in the dim light, mutual realization dawning. They were not alone in these hidden depths, and whatever rituals the manuscript had described were not merely historical curiosities. The custodes veritatis were still active, still practicing their ancient rites somewhere deeper in this underground complex. The question now was whether to retreat with the evidence they had already gathered, or to press forward and confront directly whatever ceremony was currently underway. The decision was made for them when the sound of footsteps echoed from the passage they had used to enter the chamber. Someone was approaching from behind, cutting off their retreat. Christopher and Sophia exchanged panicked glances before Sophia pointed urgently to a narrow space between two tall storage cabinets, barely enough room for them to squeeze into, but their only option for concealment. They pressed themselves into the gap just as the door from the antechamber swung open, extinguishing their flashlights and holding their breath as two figures entered the chamber of preparation. Christopher, positioned where he could see through a small gap between the cabinets, felt his blood freeze as he recognized one of the newcomers. Cardinal Rossi, his formal robes replaced by a simple black cassock, adorned only with the symbol of the eye in flames embroidered over his heart. Everything must be prepared precisely. the cardinal was saying to his companion, a younger priest Christopher didn't recognize. Tonight's vessel has been properly conditioned, but the alignment is particularly sensitive. We cannot risk another failure. The younger man nodded, moving to the shelves of containers with practiced familiarity, selecting several and placing them on a small table beside the altar. The others are already assembling in the inner sanctum, he reported as he worked. Father Brennan has brought the vessel from the preparation cells. She's responsive to the preliminary invocations, which suggests a strong compatibility. At the mention of Father Brennan, Christopher had to stifle a gasp. The priest he had dined with hours earlier, who had spoken so eloquently about the Church's evolution beyond its dark past, was part of this. The cardinal supervised the younger priest's preparations with critical attention, occasionally correcting the arrangement of items or the proportions of substances being mixed in a shallow bowl. Their conversation continued, revealing fragments of information that confirmed Christopher's worst fears about the order's continued activities, references to previous vessels, to the containment of corruption, and to a ceremony called the binding that apparently needed to be renewed periodically. Most chilling was their casual tone. These men spoke of human sacrifice with the bureaucratic detachment of office workers discussing quarterly reports. Christopher felt Sophia trembling beside him. Whether from fear or rage he couldn't tell, but he placed a steadying hand on her arm, knowing that discovery now would likely make them the next vessels for whatever abhorrent ritual was being prepared. After what seemed an eternity, but was probably no more than 15 minutes, the cardinal pronounced himself satisfied with the preparations. "Bring everything to the inner sanctum," he instructed his assistant. "I will join the circle shortly." The younger priest gathered the prepared items onto a tray and departed through the far door, from which the sound of chanting had grown steadily more distinct. Cardinal Rossi remained behind, moving to a small alcove Christopher hadn't noticed earlier. From it, he removed what appeared to be a ceremonial robe of deep crimson, embroidered with complex symbols in gold thread. As the cardinal changed, Christopher managed to capture several photographs through the gap, his phone set to silent and its flash disabled. Each image potentially represented evidence that could expose centuries of atrocities if they managed to escape with it. Once robed, the cardinal paused before a small mirror, adjusting his appearance with the vanity of an actor preparing for a performance. Then, straightening to his full height and assuming an expression of solemn authority, he departed through the same door his assistant had used, leaving the chamber of preparation empty once more. Christopher and Sophia waited several agonizing minutes to ensure he wouldn't return before emerging from their hiding place, muscles cramped from the prolonged confinement in such a tight space. "We need to see what's happening in there," Christopher whispered, his academic detachment completely abandoned in the face of imminent human sacrifice. "If someone's life is at stake," Sophia cut him off with a sharp gesture, "if we burst in there, we'll only get ourselves killed or worse. We need to document what we can and get this evidence out. That's how we save not just one victim, but potentially many more." The logic was sound, but Christopher couldn't reconcile himself to leaving someone to suffer when intervention might be possible. "You go back," he said, already moving toward the door that led deeper. "Take my phone with the photos we've already taken. I'll try to get closer, see if there's a way to observe without being seen. Maybe create a distraction that gives their vessel a chance to escape." Sophia's expression shifted from shock to determination. "I'm not leaving you," she said firmly. "Either we both go back now or we both go forward. I vote forward." Her courage shamed his attempt to send her to safety alone, and with a nod of acknowledgement, he accepted her decision. Together, they approached the door to the inner sanctum, Christopher drawing a deep breath before easing it open just enough to peer through. The scene beyond surpassed their worst expectations. A vast circular chamber, far larger than the one they currently occupied, stretched before them. Its walls curved upward to a domed ceiling, pierced by a circular opening that revealed the night sky above. Somehow connecting to the surface, despite the many levels Christopher knew must lie between this subterranean space and the Vatican grounds above. Arranged in a circle around a central platform stood 12 robed figures, Cardinal Rossi now among them. their crimson vestments seeming to absorb the light from the torches mounted around the chamber's perimeter. On the platform itself, a young woman was secured to an upright framework of metal and wood, her white gown contrasting starkly with the dark stone and red robes surrounding her. Though her face was obscured from their vantage point, her posture conveyed terror and resignation in equal measure. "The binding must be renewed," Cardinal Rossi's voice echoed through the chamber as he raised his arms dramatically. "The corruption that seeps from the depths must be contained. As it was in the beginning, so shall it continue until the end of days." The other robed figures responded in unison, their voices blending in a chant that sent shivers down Christopher's spine. Through sacrifice, protection; through suffering, salvation; through darkness, the light endures. As the chant continued, Christopher scanned the chamber desperately for any sign of Father Brennan, finally locating him among the circle of participants. The priest's face, visible when he turned slightly toward the door, showed none of the warmth or humanity Christopher had witnessed at dinner. Only a cold intensity focused entirely on the ritual unfolding before him. Christopher's attention was drawn back to the central platform as one of the robed figures approached the restrained woman, carrying an ornate silver chalice. The cardinal's voice rose above the continuing chant. "The vessel is prepared to receive that which must not walk freely in the world. Through her suffering, the binding is renewed for another cycle. Through her sacrifice, the corruption is contained." The figure with the chalice reached the platform and raised the vessel to the woman's lips. Though she initially tried to turn her head away, two other members of the circle moved to hold her still, forcing her to drink the contents. Almost immediately, her body began to convulse, straining against the restraints as a keening wail escaped her throat, a sound so primal and agonized that Christopher felt it like a physical blow. Unable to remain a passive observer any longer, Christopher prepared to push the door fully open and intervene, regardless of the consequences. Sophia's hand on his arm stopped him, not restraining, but directing his attention to something he had missed. Near the edge of the circle, partially concealed behind one of the robed figures, a figure in ordinary clothes was recording the ceremony with what appeared to be a small camera. Unlike the participants, this person's posture conveyed not reverence, but clinical observation, as if documenting the ritual for purposes unknown. Before Christopher could process this unexpected element, the woman on the platform began to speak, or rather, sounds emerged from her mouth that seemed less like speech and more like multiple voices overlapping, some deep and guttural, others high and keening, none of them human. The robed figures responded with increased intensity in their chanting, several moving to form a tighter circle around the platform, while Cardinal Rossi produced a curved ceremonial knife from within his robes. The woman's body contorted in ways that defied natural anatomy, her joints bending at impossible angles as the multiple voices emerging from her throat rose to a crescendo of inhuman sound. "The vessel accepts the burden," the cardinal intoned, raising the knife. "The binding is renewed through blood freely given in service to the greater protection." Ina. Christopher knew with sickening certainty what would happen next. The manuscript had described this moment in clinical detail, the harvesting of the vessel once it had absorbed the corruption. He could not allow it to happen before his eyes. Without further hesitation, Christopher shoved the door fully open and stepped into the chamber, his voice cutting through the chants with unexpected authority. "Stop this now!" The effect was instantaneous, the ceremonial circle broken as robed figures turned in shock toward the interruption, the chanting faltering into confused silence. In the momentary chaos, Christopher noticed several details with crystalline clarity. The observer with the camera slipping quickly into a side passage, Father Brennan's face transforming from ritualistic focus to horrified recognition, and Cardinal Rossi's expression shifting from surprise to a cold, calculated fury. "Dr. Brown," the cardinal said, his voice deceptively calm despite the ceremonial knife still clutched in his hand, "you have wandered far from your authorized research areas." "Release her," Christopher demanded, stepping further into the chamber with Sophia close behind him, both trying to project a confidence they didn't feel. "Whatever you believe you're doing here, it's over." We have documented everything, the chambers, the preparations, this ceremony. Multiple copies of the evidence are already secured and will be released if anything happens to us. It was a desperate bluff, but delivered with enough conviction to cause visible uncertainty among some of the robed figures. The woman on the platform had fallen silent, her body no longer contorting but hanging limply in her restraints, either unconscious or in some altered state following whatever substance she had been forced to consume. Cardinal Rossi's composure never wavered. "You understand nothing of what you are interfering with," he said, his voice echoing in the now silent chamber. "This is not cruelty, it is necessity. For centuries, the Custodes Veritatis have contained forces that would destroy not just faith, but humanity itself. What you see as sacrifice, we know as salvation." He gestured toward the woman. This vessel was chosen with care, a criminal already condemned, given purpose in her final service. Without the binding, what we contain would corrupt thousands, perhaps millions. Your misguided intervention threatens everything. As he spoke, Christopher noticed the other members of the circle subtly repositioning themselves, moving to block potential escape routes. Whatever evidence they had gathered would mean nothing if they couldn't get out to share it. Father Brennan stepped forward, removing his ceremonial hood to fully reveal his face. "Christopher, please listen," he implored, his voice carrying the same sincerity it had during their dinner conversation. "What the Cardinal says is true. I reacted as you did when I first discovered the Order's work, but I came to understand its necessity. Throughout history, certain entities have sought entry into our world. The Church's primary mission has always been spiritual protection, most visibly through faith and good works, but also through more direct means when required. The manuscripts you found tell only part of the story." His gaze shifted to include Sophia. "Both of you have proven your intelligence and commitment to truth. The Custodes Veritatis needs minds like yours. Join us in understanding rather than condemning." The offer hung in the air, seductive in its promise of explanation and belonging rather than conflict. For a moment, Christopher found himself wavering. What if they were telling the truth? What if these rituals, horrific as they appeared, were indeed preventing some greater evil? The manuscript had hinted at corrupting forces and entities seeking entry, phrases he had interpreted as metaphors for human impulses or social threat. But the woman's impossible contortions and the inhuman voices that had emerged from her suggested something beyond rational explanation. Sophia's voice broke through his momentary doubt. "If your cause is so righteous," she challenged, "why the secrecy? Why hidden chambers and midnight rituals? Why not seek broader validation for your methods?" "Because humanity fears what it doesn't understand," Cardinal Rossi replied smoothly. "Because most lack the courage to acknowledge certain realities, preferring comfortable illusions. The same reason the Church has always maintained mysteries accessible only to the initiated." His gaze hardened. "You now stand at a threshold, Dr. Brown, Dr. Ricci. Step forward into deeper understanding or backward into ignorance, but know that backward is no longer truly an option. You have seen too much." The threat beneath the philosophical framing was unmistakable. Christopher glanced at Sophia, reading in her expression the same conclusion he had reached. Regardless of the truth about what the Custodes Veritatis were containing, their methods were unacceptable, their secrecy corrupting, their power unchecked by any meaningful oversight. Whatever choice they made in this moment would define the remainder of their lives, however long or short those might be. "We choose truth," Christopher said firmly, reaching for Sophia's hand and finding it already extended toward his. "Whatever forces you claim to be containing, your methods betray your claims of righteousness. True protection doesn't require secrecy and suffering. It demands transparency and consent." As he spoke, Christopher was keenly aware of their precarious position. The circle had tightened around them, and while some members showed signs of discomfort or uncertainty, Cardinal Rossi's expression had hardened into something approaching hatred. Father Brennan looked genuinely pained, as if Christopher's rejection were a personal betrayal rather than a moral stand. "Then you leave us no choice," the Cardinal said coldly. "Contain them. They will serve as vessels for the next binding." What happened next occurred with such speed that Christopher would later struggle to reconstruct the sequence of events. As several robed figures moved to seize them, a deafening alarm suddenly blared throughout the chamber. Not a modern electronic sound, but the ancient toll of bells designed to warn of catastrophic threats. The distraction provided just enough chaos for Christopher and Sophia to break for the nearest exit. Not the door they had entered through, but a different passage that several of the robed figures had used when fleeing the alarm. Behind them, Cardinal Rossi shouted commands that were lost in the cacophony of bells and confused voices. The woman on the platform remained forgotten in the chaos, still secured to her framework, but stirring now, as if awakening from a trance. The passage they had chosen ascended steeply, rough stone steps worn smooth by centuries of use. Christopher and Sophia ran blindly, having no map of this section, but driven by the fundamental instinct to move upward, toward the surface and potential safety. The alarm continued to echo through the stone corridors, joined now by shouts and the sound of multiple footsteps in pursuit. "There must be an exit to the main basilica," Sophia gasped as they paused at a junction of 3 passages. The manuscript mentioned emergency routes in case containment was breached. Christopher nodded, trying to orient himself by the subtle flow of air currents. "This way," he decided, choosing the passage where the faintest hint of fresher air suggested a connection to the outside world. Their path led them through a series of increasingly narrow corridors, some so ancient that roots from trees on the Vatican grounds above had penetrated the stone, creating an eerie organic webbing across sections of ceiling. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter, suggesting they had either chosen a route their hunters didn't expect or had gained significant distance. Just as Christopher began to hope they might escape, they rounded a corner and found themselves facing a massive iron door, its surface covered in the now familiar symbols of the Custodes Veritatis. "No," Sophia whispered, the single syllable containing volumes of despair as she pushed against the unyielding metal. "There must be a mechanism, a way to open it," Christopher insisted, running his hands over the door's surface and the surrounding stonework, searching for hidden levers or pressure points like those that had revealed the entrance hours earlier. Before they could locate any opening mechanism, the sound of footsteps resumed, much closer now. "They're herding us," Sophia realized aloud. "They know these passages completely. They've been driving us exactly where they want us." The truth of her observation was confirmed moments later when Father Brennan appeared at the corridor's end, alone, but carrying what appeared to be a tranquilizer gun. "Please, don't make this more difficult," he said, his voice echoing in the confined space. "The Order has contained threats for centuries without fail. 2 more vessels will not burden my conscience if the alternative is releasing what we've bound." He raised the weapon, his aim steady despite the conflict visible in his expression. "The sedative is humane. You'll wake as part of something greater than yourselves." Christopher stepped in front of Sophia, though the gesture was more symbolic than practical, given the narrow corridor. "You spoke of the Church evolving, Thomas, of acknowledging past errors and embracing dialogue rather than condemnation. Was any of that real, or just a convenient mask?" The question seemed to strike home, causing Father Brennan's aim to waver slightly. "I meant every word," he insisted, "but some threats cannot be dialogued with, some forces cannot be reasoned with or reformed. What we contain is one such force, ancient, patient, and utterly inimical to human consciousness. The methods are regrettable but necessary." His finger tightened on the trigger. "I am truly sorry, Christopher. In another life we might have been friends." The shot never came. As Father Brennan prepared to fire, a section of wall behind him collapsed inward with a thunderous crack, showering him with debris and filling the passage with dust. Through the newly created opening surged several figures in the distinctive uniform of the Swiss Guard, the Vatican's elite security force, led by a man Christopher recognized with shock, the unassuming observer who had been recording the ceremony in the inner sanctum. "Federal police," the man shouted in accented English, training his weapon on the stunned priest. "Father Thomas Brennan, you are under arrest for suspected involvement in kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment and homicide." More guards poured through the breach, securing Father Brennan and moving quickly to reach Christopher and Sophia. "Dr. Brown, Dr. Ricci," their leader addressed them, lowering his weapon. I am Inspector Klaus Weber, Interpol. We've been investigating disappearances connected to the Vatican for 3 years. Your discovery accelerated our timeline considerably. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Christopher and Sophia were escorted to safety through the breach, which connected to maintenance tunnels used by Vatican service personnel. Inspector Weber explained that Interpol had infiltrated the Vatican months earlier after connecting a pattern of disappearances across Europe to individuals who had contact with certain Vatican officials. We suspected some sort of cult activity, he told them, as medical personnel checked them for injuries. But we lacked hard evidence of where and how they were operating. When our surveillance picked up unusual interest in your research activities, we began monitoring more closely. Your discovery of the manuscript and subsequent investigation led us directly to active participants during an actual ceremony, evidence that can't be denied or buried. The operation was unprecedented, a law enforcement raid within Vatican City targeting individuals including high-ranking church officials. The political and diplomatic ramifications would be felt for years, perhaps decades. As dawn broke over St. Peter's Square, the Vatican was in lockdown, with bewildered tourists turned away by guards, while plainclothes investigators moved discreetly through restricted areas, documenting everything. Christopher learned that the woman from the ceremony had been rescued and was receiving medical treatment, though the substances she had been given left her in a precarious condition. Other victims had been found in preparation cells nearby, individuals who had been reported missing from various European countries over the previous months. "What about the manuscript?" Christopher asked Weber, as they sat in a makeshift command center established in a Vatican administrative building. "And everything it describes, centuries of these rituals, the containment they claim to be maintaining?" The inspector's expression was difficult to read. "We're focusing on prosecutable crimes committed in the present," he said carefully. "Historical claims will be investigated, but proving events from centuries past presents obvious challenges. As for their beliefs about what they were containing," he hesitated, choosing his words with precision. "We deal in evidence, Dr. Brown. Human trafficking, false imprisonment, homicide. These are concrete crimes with concrete victims. Claims about supernatural forces are beyond our jurisdiction." The diplomatic answer frustrated Christopher, but he understood the pragmatic approach. Modern law enforcement couldn't prosecute centuries of ritual sacrifice, nor could it definitively disprove claims about corrupting forces requiring containment. What mattered was that the current activities of the Custodes Veritatis had been exposed and halted, its members identified, and its victims rescued. The manuscript itself had been taken as evidence, along with all the documentation Christopher and Sophia had gathered. "What happens now?" Sophia asked, the question encompassing far more than just the immediate future. Inspector Weber sighed, the weariness of the long operation evident in his posture. "For you too? Debriefing, witness statements, probable testimony if cases go to trial. Your lives have become significantly more complicated, I'm afraid." Indeed, as the initial shock wore off, Christopher began to grasp the full implications of their discovery and its exposure. Their academic careers within the Church's institutions were certainly over. Their safety might be compromised for years to come, given the reach and resources of an organization that had operated secretly for centuries. The manuscript had mentioned external guardians and allies beyond the walls, phrases that took on ominous new meaning in light of how effectively the Custodes Veritatis had maintained their secrecy across generations. Moreover, Cardinal Rossi remained at large, having disappeared during the confusion of the raid, taking with him whatever knowledge and authority he represented within the Order's hierarchy. Late that afternoon, Christopher found himself alone for the first time since the raid, given temporary quarters in a secure location while the investigation continued. Sophia was in a similar room nearby, both of them under protective custody, while Interpol assessed potential threats. Sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, Christopher finally allowed the events of the past days to fully register, his body shaking with delayed shock and exhaustion. The manuscript's contents, the hidden chambers, the woman bound to that terrible framework, all of it swirled in his mind alongside more troubling questions. Had they truly stopped something evil or merely interrupted it? Was there any truth to the Order's claims about what they were containing? And what would happen now that the binding ritual had been prevented? A soft knock at his door preceded the arrival of Inspector Weber, carrying a manila folder and wearing an expression that suggested further complications. "Dr. Brown, I thought you should know. The woman from the ceremony died an hour ago," he said without preamble. "The medical team couldn't counteract whatever she was given. Before she died, she was speaking in multiple languages, including several that have been extinct for centuries. The staff reported other anomalies that I'm not at liberty to detail." He placed the folder on the small table by the bed. "This contains arrangements for your relocation. We believe it's in your best interest to leave Italy as soon as possible under a new identity. Dr. Ricci is being offered similar protection." The news of the woman's death hit Christopher like a physical blow, compounded by the implication that something unexplainable had accompanied it. "You believe them now, don't you?" he challenged the inspector. "About what they were containing. That's why you're rushing to get us out of the country." Weber's professionally neutral expression cracked slightly, revealing a man grappling with concepts that didn't fit his training or worldview. "What I believe is irrelevant," he replied carefully. "What I know is that several of my agents have requested reassignment after what they witnessed during the victim's final hours. I know that 3 members of the Custodes Veritatis have committed suicide since being taken into custody, each leaving identical notes claiming that the corruption will now spread unchecked. And I know that your continued safety cannot be guaranteed in Rome." Christopher absorbed this information in silence, understanding that Weber was sharing more than he should out of some personal sense of obligation. "Where would we go?" he finally asked. "What would we do? Our entire careers, our identities, are tied to our work here." The inspector's response was gentle but firm. "You would go where we can protect you, and you would build new lives. Together or separately, that would be your choice. But make no mistake, Dr. Brown, the Custodes Veritatis has existed for centuries. Despite our raid, we've likely only identified a fraction of its members. Those who remain will view you as directly responsible for disrupting a ritual they believe essential to some greater protection. They will never stop looking for you." The reality of their situation settled over Christopher like a shroud. In seeking truth, he and Sophia had irrevocably altered the courses of their lives, and possibly much more if even a fraction of the Custodes Veritatis claims were valid. The manuscript had described the consequences of a failed binding in apocalyptic terms: corruption spreading like a contagion through susceptible minds, manifesting in escalating violence, madness, and societal breakdown. Christopher had dismissed these as typical religious fear-mongering, but the woman's death and the anomalies Weber alluded to gave him pause. What if they had interfered with something they didn't understand? What if, in stopping an evident evil, they had unwittingly released something worse? "I need to speak with Sophia," Christopher said, rising from the bed with sudden determination. "Whatever decisions we make them together. We're in this because we both chose truth over comfortable ignorance." Weber nodded, leading him to Sophia's room, where she was already reviewing her own relocation folder. Her eyes met Christopher's with a mixture of fear and resolve that mirrored his own emotions. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of shared experience creating a bond stronger than words could express. Then, Sophia broke the silence. "Whatever comes next, I don't regret what we did. Some truths demand to be known, whatever the cost." Christopher nodded, crossing the room to take her hands in his. "Together, then?" he asked simply. Her answer was equally direct. "Together." As night fell over the Vatican, the ancient seat of Catholic power seemed unnaturally quiet, its usual rhythms disrupted by the ongoing investigation. In his private chapel, Pope Benedict XVI knelt in prayer, having been briefed on the existence of the Custodes Veritatis and its centuries of unsanctioned activities beneath the heart of the Church. In a secure medical facility, physicians documented inexplicable phenomena surrounding the body of the woman who had almost become the latest vessel in an unbroken chain of sacrifices. Throughout Rome, members of the order who had escaped the raid gathered in safe houses, communicating through channels established generations ago for exactly such contingencies. And in a nondescript hotel room outside the city, Cardinal Rossi made preparations for what the manuscript had called the final binding, a ritual requiring not one vessel, but 13, powerful enough to contain what had been released, even without the precisely aligned celestial conditions normally required. Christopher and Sophia spent their last night in Rome, packing the few possessions they would take into their new lives, their academic accomplishments and personal histories, soon to be replaced by carefully constructed alternative pasts. As Christopher placed the last of his books in a box for storage, he paused at a volume of medieval church history, a gift from his doctoral advisor when he had received the Vatican appointment. Opening it to the inscription, he read words that now carried unintended prophecy. In seeking truth within hallowed walls, remember that light reveals both beauty and shadow. He closed the book gently, returning it to the box. Whatever shadows they had revealed, whatever consequences might follow, the choice for truth had been the only one his conscience could accept. The next morning, as they prepared to leave for an undisclosed location under Interpol protection, Inspector Weber delivered one final piece of information. Overnight, 3 seemingly unconnected individuals in different parts of Rome had committed violent acts completely out of character with their prior behavior. Each, when apprehended, spoke of voices and visions that had compelled them. Each bore a small mark on their palm, a burn in the shape of an eye within a triangle of flames. The same symbol that had adorned the robes of the Custodes Veritatis. It may be coincidence, Weber said, not sounding convinced of his own suggestion, or mass hysteria triggered by leaked information about the raid. The alternative, that something had indeed been released, remained unspoken between them. As their secure transport pulled away from the Vatican for the last time, Christopher watched the dome of St. Peter's Basilica recede in the distance. Beneath its magnificent exterior, beneath the art and history and faith that had drawn him to study there, lay chambers that would now be sealed with modern security rather than ancient stones, their secrets exposed but perhaps not eliminated. Sophia's hand found his, warm and reassuring, despite the uncertainty that stretched before them. They had chosen truth and would face whatever consequences followed, together. The manuscript's final pages had contained a warning that now echoed in Christopher's mind with new significance. The price of revelation is transformation. Those who break the seals of silence are forever marked by what they unleash. Whether that transformation would prove to be punishment or liberation remained to be seen, but of one thing Christopher was certain. There could be no returning to the comfortable ignorance of before. Like the truth they had uncovered, they too had been irrevocably changed, for better or worse, only time would tell.